The first knock came at dawn, sharp, arrogant, and filled with the kind of authority only the self-appointed believe they have. Little did I know, it was the beginning of a war I never asked for. I'd been living in Sunset Harbor for 3 years, drawn by the promise of peace that only comes from water's edge. The lake stretched endlessly before my small dock, its surface catching the morning light like scattered diamonds. Salt hung in the air, not ocean salt, but that clean, mineral scent of deep fresh water that reminded me of simpler times. The gentle creak of boat ropes against cleats had become my morning symphony, replacing the harsh clang of ship bells and barked orders that had defined 30 years of my life. At 62, I'd earned this quiet. Every dawn, I'd sit on my deck with black coffee steaming in the cool air, watching mallards glide across the mirror-smooth water. The old boat bobbed gently at my private dock, her weathered hull catching the light just right. She wasn't much to look at. Chipped blue paint, sun-bleached wood, brass fittings that had seen better decades, but she was mine, and she was home. That morning started no different. Coffee in hand, I was watching the sun paint the water gold when the sound shattered my peace. Not the polite tap of a neighbor bearing fresh cookies, but the demanding rap of someone who expected immediate attention. I opened the door to find her, all 5 feet of righteous indignation wrapped in a powder blue tracksuit. Karen Weatherby, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood aesthetics. Her blonde hair was helmet-perfect despite the early hour, and her smile had the warmth of January lake ice. "Mr. Richardson." She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping onto my porch with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting their way. "We need to discuss your boat situation." I leaned against the doorframe, coffee still warm in my hands. "Morning, Karen. What situation would that be?" Her eyes flicked past me to the dock where my vessel sat peacefully moored. "That eyesore is violating our community standards. Section 4.7 of the HOA agreement clearly states that all watercraft must maintain aesthetic appeal consistent with our neighborhood's character. The boat's legal, properly registered, and on my private dock." I kept my voice level, the way you do when dealing with someone who mistakes volume for authority. Karen's smile sharpened. "The HOA has standards, Mr. Richardson. That rusty old thing brings down everyone's property values. I'm sure you understand." What I understood was that Karen had never seen real rust, the kind that blooms on ship hulls after months at sea, or the patina that forms on metal that survived things she couldn't imagine. What she called an eyesore, I called character. "The boat stays," I said simply. Her mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. "I was hoping we could resolve this amicably, but if you insist on being difficult..." She pulled out a tablet, fingers dancing across the screen with practiced efficiency. "I'm documenting this violation. You have 72 hours to remove it." "Or what?" The smile returned, cold as lake water in winter. "The HOA has enforcement mechanisms, Mr. Richardson. If you don't move it voluntarily, we'll seize it for violation of community standards. I'd hate for things to get unpleasant." She turned on her heel and marched down my walkway with military precision. Though she'd never worn a uniform in her life, I watched her go, noting the way she paused to photograph my boat from 3 different angles, each shot deliberate and calculating. As her white Lexus pulled away, I remained on the porch, coffee growing cold in my hands. The morning peace had been shattered, replaced by the familiar tension that comes before conflict. I'd felt it before. In the Persian Gulf, when radar showed bogies approaching. In the Mediterranean, when storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The electric anticipation that meant everything was about to change. Karen Weatherby thought she was dealing with just another retiree, someone who'd fold under pressure from her little kingdom of clipboards and community standards. She saw an old man with an old boat, both past their prime and ready to be swept aside for the sake of her perfect neighborhood aesthetic. She had no idea what kind of boat she was threatening. The vessel wasn't just mine. It was a piece of history, a fragment of steel and purpose that had sailed farther than Karen's imagination could reach. Those brass fittings she dismissed as tarnished had been polished by hands that knew the weight of duty. The weathered wood she called an eyesore had been walked by men who'd answered their country's call. I finished my coffee as the sun climbed higher, warming the dock where my boat, our boat, waited patiently. Karen had fired the first shot in a war she didn't understand, against an enemy she'd underestimated. She thought she held all the cards with her HOA bylaws and community standards. She was about to learn that some battles aren't won with paperwork, and some boats carry more than just memories. As I headed inside to make a few phone calls, one thought echoed in my mind with the certainty of tides and the inevitability of storms. Karen Weatherby had no idea what she'd just declared war on. People saw only a boat, chipped paint, old wood. What they didn't see was the history carved into its hull. The calls started that afternoon. Not from Karen directly, she was too clever for that, but from various HOA committee members, each one carefully coached in their talking points. Mrs. Henderson from the landscaping committee wondered if I'd considered a more modern watercraft. Bob Martinez from Community Standards mentioned he'd heard about my boat issue and wanted to offer helpful suggestions for compliance. By evening, I'd received 7 calls, 4 emails, and a hand-delivered letter outlining the immediate steps necessary to bring your property into alignment with community standards. Karen's fingerprints were on every single communication, though she'd been careful not to sign anything directly. I sat on my deck as sunset painted the sky crimson. The letter crumpled on the table beside me. The boat rocked gently in her slip, and for a moment, I wasn't 62 years old in a lake community. I was 35 again, standing on a rain-swept deck in the North Atlantic, salt spray stinging my face as we cut through 8-foot swells. The USS Defiance had been my first command. Not this boat, but her namesake, a guided missile destroyer that had been my home for 3 years. When the Navy decommissioned her, they'd salvaged what they could. The brass compass housing now mounted on my boat's cabin had guided us through 2 deployments. The ship's wheel, weathered smooth by countless hands, had turned through storms that would have terrified Karen into hysteria. This boat, my boat, wasn't just transportation. She was a memorial, a piece of maritime history that the Navy had entrusted to my care when I retired. Commander James Richardson, 30 years of service, 2 bronze stars, and the respect of every sailor who'd ever served under him. That's what the retirement ceremony citation had read. Anyway, what it hadn't mentioned was the nightmares that still came with storm fronts, or the way my hands sometimes shook when fog rolled in thick enough to swallow the horizon. It hadn't listed the friends whose names were now carved in granite at Arlington, or the weight of decisions that had sent good people into harm's way. But it had mentioned the boat. In recognition of distinguished service and unwavering dedication to the principles of naval tradition, we present this vessel to carry forward the memory of those who served and the values they defended. I'd been too choked up to speak when Admiral Morrison had handed me the keys. The boat wasn't much, a 32-foot former patrol craft, stripped of weapons, but still bearing the subtle marks of military service. Small enough for one man to handle, sturdy enough to weather any storm the lake could throw at her. She'd been my sanctuary for 3 years, the place where I could remember without judgment and grieve without questions. Some nights I'd sleep aboard her, listening to the water lap against her hull, feeling connected to something larger than HOA politics and neighborhood drama. Karen didn't understand any of that. To her, the boat was just an obstacle to her perfect vision of suburban paradise, where every dock held gleaming fiberglass pleasure craft, and every lawn was measured to regulation height. She saw rust and called it decay. She saw history and called it junk. The harassment escalated daily. My mailbox became a crime scene of official notices, each one more threatening than the last. Final warning stamped in red ink. Compliance required in bold Arial font. Legal action pending. On HOA letterhead that Karen probably had printed special for the occasion, the fines started. Small, $50 for non-compliance with aesthetic standards. Then $100 for continued violation. After official notice. By the end of the week, they'd ballooned to $300 per day, with threats of legal action and property liens. I found the notes stuffed in my mailbox, taped to my door, even tucked under my car's windshield wipers. Each one signed by different HOA committee members, but I could smell Karen's involvement like cheap perfume. She was orchestrating a campaign of bureaucratic terrorism, using the HOA machinery to wage personal war. The worst part wasn't the money. I had plenty saved from 30 years of Navy paychecks and pension benefits. It was the principle of the thing. I'd spent my career defending the Constitution against enemies foreign and domestic, only to find myself under siege by a homeowners association armed with clipboards and spite. Some nights I'd sit in the boat's small cabin, surrounded by memories and mementos, torn between the desire to pack up and leave and the stubborn refusal to let Karen win. The safe built into the cabin's bulkhead held more than just insurance papers and registration documents. Deep inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed against moisture, were the official Navy transfer documents that made this boat my responsibility. But they also made her something more, something Karen couldn't possibly understand. I'd unfold those papers by lamplight, reading the technical specifications and transfer protocols, remembering the day Admiral Morrison had explained what I was really being given. "She's yours to care for, Commander," he'd said. "But she'll always be Navy property. That makes you her custodian, not just her owner." The distinction mattered more than Karen could know. What she saw as a private boat was actually a piece of U.S. Navy history, on permanent loan to a retired officer deemed worthy of the responsibility. The rust she complained about was the patina of service. The worn wood she called an eyesore had been shaped by salt spray and sacrifice. As the harassment intensified and the fines mounted, I made my decision. Karen wanted to play hardball with what she thought was just another boat owner. She was about to discover that some boats carry more authority than HOA bylaws, and some fights involve enemies she'd never considered. Karen thought it was just a toy floating at my dock. She was about to find out it was a relic of war, protected by laws she'd never read, and backed by an authority she'd never challenged. The storm was coming, and she had no idea how deep the water really was. By week's end, my mailbox looked like a crime scene. Red ink, bold stamps, threats that dripped with venom. Every morning brought fresh assault via the Postal Service. Karen had weaponized the U.S. mail system with military efficiency, turning my daily routine into a gauntlet of certified letters, violation notices, and increasingly hysterical demands for compliance. The mailman, Jerry, started giving me apologetic looks as he stuffed envelope after envelope into my box. "Sorry, Mr. Richardson," he'd mutter, hefting another stack of HOA correspondence. "Looks like someone's got it in for you." The paper trail read like a bureaucratic fever dream. Monday brought notice of violation, Sauser Old 1, $50 for maintaining an IU aesthetically inconsistent watercraft. Tuesday, escalated to formal citation for Zord 2, 100, 50 for continued defiance of community standards. By Wednesday, we'd reached legal warning, Dr. Ozo 3, $300 plus attorney fees for willful disregard of binding neighborhood covenants. Each letter bore different signatures from various committee members, but Karen's puppet strings showed through every carefully worded threat. She'd turned the entire HOA apparatus into her personal army, each member marching to her tune of righteous indignation and property value protection. The surveillance began Friday morning. I was sipping coffee on my deck when I spotted her. Powder blue tracksuit, bright as a distress flare, clipboard in hand, camera slung around her neck like she was documenting war crimes. Karen had positioned herself at the public access point 50 yards down the shore. Telephoto lens trained on my dock like a sniper's scope. She wasn't subtle. The woman photographed my boat from every conceivable angle, muttering into a small recorder between shots. 7:43 a.m., subject vessel displaying continued aesthetic violations. Paint deterioration visible on port side. Rust stains on anchor housing. Overall appearance inconsistent with neighborhood character standards. I watched her performance with the same detached interest I'd once observed enemy reconnaissance flights. Karen thought she was gathering evidence for her case, but she was actually documenting her own obsession. No reasonable person spends 3 hours photographing a neighbor's boat from behind a park bench. The community began to fracture along predictable lines. Karen's inner circle, mostly recent retirees with too much time and too little purpose, rallied around her cause with the fervor of true believers. They'd patrol the neighborhood in golf carts, clipboards ready, hunting for violations with the dedication of missionary work. But others started showing quiet support. Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down would wave a little longer when she saw me outside. Tom Bradley, whose own deck furniture had once been cited for non-regulation color schemes, began making pointed comments about HOA overreach at community meetings. The turning point came when Karen hired professionals. Saturday morning, I was working in my small workshop when I heard the rumble of heavy engines. Through the window, I watched a massive tow truck navigate the narrow community streets, its driver clearly uncomfortable with the tight spaces between parked cars and landscaped medians. Behind it came Karen's Lexus, followed by a second vehicle containing what looked like her entire HOA enforcement committee. She'd assembled a convoy for what she obviously considered the final battle. The tow truck driver, a weathered man named Pete, whose company logo suggested he specialized in repo work, approached my dock with obvious reluctance. Karen strutted behind him like a general reviewing troops, clipboard at the ready. Her committee members fanned out in what they probably thought was tactical formation. "That's the vessel," Karen announced, pointing at my boat with the authority of someone who'd never doubted their own righteousness. "Complete violation of community standards. We have full authority to remove it under Section 4.7 of the Neighborhood Covenants." Pete studied my boat with professional interest, taking note of details Karen had missed. His eyes lingered on the brass fittings, the military-style cleats, the subtle modifications that marked her as something more than a pleasure craft. When he spotted the small brass plaque mounted near the cabin door, the one identifying her former Navy designation, his expression changed entirely. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this looks like it might be military property." Karen's laugh could have shattered glass. "It's a rusty old boat owned by a stubborn retiree. There's nothing military about it." But Pete had seen enough repo jobs to recognize potential complications. Military vehicles, even decommissioned ones, came with federal paperwork and jurisdictional nightmares that could turn a simple tow into a legal catastrophe. He'd once tried to repo a Humvee that looked civilian enough, only to discover it was still technically Army property on indefinite loan. The resulting paperwork had taken 6 months to untangle. "I'd need to see the registration and ownership documents," Pete said, backing away from the boat like it might explode. "If there's any federal involvement, we could be looking at serious legal issues." Karen's face flushed red beneath her makeup. "Are you seriously going to let this old man intimidate you? It's just a boat." But Pete was already walking back to his truck, hands raised in surrender. "Sorry, lady. I don't touch anything that might be government property. You need a federal marshal for that kind of seizure, and they don't work weekends." As the tow truck rumbled away, Karen stood on my dock like Napoleon watching Moscow burn. Her committee members shuffled nervously, suddenly fascinated by their phones and the distant horizon. The perfect plan had collapsed because her hired muscle had more sense than she did. But defeat only made her more dangerous. That night, I found a new message painted on my garage door in red spray paint. "Remove that boat, or else." The grammar was perfect, the letters precisely formed. Karen's teacher background showing through even in vandalism. I stood in my driveway, staring at the dripping letters, feeling something shift inside me. For 3 years I'd tried to live quietly, to avoid the conflicts and confrontations that had defined my military career. I'd thought retirement meant peace, that I could simply exist without fighting anyone's wars. Karen had just reminded me that some people interpret peace as weakness and kindness as surrender. She'd escalated from bureaucratic harassment to property destruction, crossing lines that demanded response. As I called the police to report the vandalism, I made a decision that had been building for days. Karen wanted to play hardball with what she thought was just another retiree. She was about to discover that some enemies come with reinforcements she'd never considered. The siege had failed, but the war was just beginning, and Karen had no idea what kind of arsenal she was really facing. The night they gathered under the flickering fluorescent lights of the clubhouse, they weren't neighbors anymore. They were conspirators. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for Thursday night, advertised only to Karen's inner circle through whispered phone calls and careful text messages. No official notifications, no community posting, just a select gathering of the faithful summoned to plan what they probably thought of as the final solution to their boat problem. I shouldn't have known about it. Mrs. Chen had grandchildren visiting that week, and her 12-year-old grandson Tommy had a talent for being invisible while adults discussed boring grown-up stuff. He'd been riding his bike past the clubhouse when he overheard Karen scheduling the secret session, then dutifully reported back to his grandmother, who shared the intelligence with me over coffee the next morning. "She's planning something," Mrs. Chen warned, her usually gentle voice tight with concern. Tommy said she was talking about permanent solutions and teaching lessons. That woman has lost perspective. By Thursday evening, I'd positioned myself in the landscaping behind the clubhouse, close enough to hear through the thin walls but hidden by the overgrown azaleas that Karen's landscaping committee had somehow overlooked. The meeting had already started when I settled into my hiding spot, the familiar voices carrying clearly through the poorly insulated building. Karen stood at the head of the room like a prosecutor addressing a jury. Her presentation materials spread across the table with military precision. Photographs of my boat from every angle, printed copies of every violation notice, a thick stack of what looked like legal documents prepared by her personal attorney. "This situation has gone too far," she declared to the assembled board members. "Mr. Richardson has shown complete disregard for our community standards and made a mockery of our authority. The time for polite requests has passed." The board, 5 neighbors I'd once considered reasonable people, sat around the folding table like a tribunal. Bob Martinez from Community Standards nodded along eagerly, his clipboard full of notes about various neighborhood violations he'd been documenting. Sarah Walsh from the Architectural Review Committee kept glancing at the door nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the secretive nature of the gathering. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked Jim Thompson, the HOA treasurer, and the only person in the room who seemed to understand they might be venturing into dangerous legal territory. Karen's smile could have powered the building's weak lighting. "Emergency seizure and auction. Section 8.3 of our covenants allows for immediate removal of property that poses ongoing violations of community standards. We vote tonight, implement tomorrow, and by weekend, his eyesore becomes someone else's problem." The air grew thick with nervous energy. Even Karen's most devoted followers seemed to sense they were crossing lines that might have consequences. But she'd done her homework, prepared her case with the thoroughness of someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks. The boat is legally defined as personal property, stored on community waterfront, she continued, consulting her prepared notes. Our covenants grant the HOA broad authority to maintain neighborhood standards. Richardson has ignored multiple warnings and accumulated over $2,000 in fines. We're well within our legal rights. What if he fights it in court? Sarah Walsh asked quietly. Karen's laugh echoed off the cheap paneling. With what? He's just a retired military officer living on a pension. Our HOA has legal insurance and a real attorney, not some overworked public defender. Besides, by the time any court case resolves, the boat will be long gone. She'd clearly spent considerable time researching the legal landscape, but like most amateur lawyers, Karen had missed crucial details that would have sent a real attorney running for cover. She saw only the broad strokes of HOA authority without understanding the federal complications that military property brought to any seizure action. The conspiracy continued for another hour, with Karen assigning specific roles to each board member. Bob would coordinate with a new towing company, one without Pete's inconvenient scruples about military property. Sarah would prepare the auction paperwork. Jim would handle the financial arrangements for disposing of unclaimed property. But it was Harold Vance, the HOA secretary and newest board member, who provided the evening's most enlightening moment. As Karen wrapped up her presentation with a call for formal votes, Harold cleared his throat nervously. "I need to ask something," he said, glancing around the room with obvious discomfort. "Has anyone actually verified that Richardson owns this boat outright? Because if there are liens, or if it's financed, or if there are any federal registrations, Karen cut him off with a wave of dismissal. It's registered to him personally. I checked the state database myself. But what if there are other complications? Harold persisted. I mean, the man served in the Navy for 30 years. Military retirement often comes with equipment assignments, property trusts, federal oversight. The room fell silent. Karen's prepared presentation hadn't addressed the possibility that her target might have resources or connections beyond a simple retiree's bank account and basic legal knowledge. Harold, Karen said with the patience of a teacher correcting a slow student, you're overthinking this. Richardson is just a bitter old man clinging to junk because he can't accept that his military service is over. We remove the boat, he files a complaint, our lawyer handles it, end of story. But Harold wasn't finished. I'm just saying, maybe we should have an attorney review the seizure plan first. Military property can involve federal jurisdiction, and if we step on the wrong agency's toes, we're not seizing military property. Karen's voice rose to a near shout. We're enforcing community standards against a private boat owned by a private citizen who thinks his Navy service gives him special privileges. The vote was 5-2 in favor of immediate seizure, with Harold and Sarah dissenting. As the meeting broke up, Harold lingered behind, ostensibly to clean up, but actually waiting for a private moment with me. He'd spotted me through the window and correctly guessed why I was hiding in the bushes. When the parking lot cleared and Karen's Lexus disappeared into the night, Harold slipped outside and found me still crouched behind the azaleas. Mr. Richardson, he whispered urgently. I tried to warn them, but Karen's convinced she knows everything. She's planning to move tomorrow morning while you're out. She's been watching your routine, knows you usually run errands Friday mornings. I stood slowly, brushing leaves from my jacket. Thank you for trying, Harold. And for the warning. That boat, he said quietly. It's not just yours, is it? There's more to this story than Karen understands. I looked back at the clubhouse where Karen had just declared war on something she couldn't comprehend. Much more, but Karen's about to get the education she never expected. As I walked home through the quiet neighborhood streets, I felt the familiar weight of decision settling on my shoulders. For weeks I'd hoped reason would prevail, that Karen would eventually recognize the futility of her campaign and find other targets for her energy. Instead, she'd chosen to escalate beyond harassment into outright theft, convinced that her HOA authority trumped any complications I might present. She'd turned my neighbors into accomplices, and my boat into a prize to be seized and sold. Karen thought she was dealing with an isolated retiree who could be bullied into submission. Tomorrow, she would discover that some boats come with backup she'd never imagined. And some veterans have friends who take oaths seriously. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one. Sometimes the loudest weapon is silence, the kind that waits, patient, certain of its strike. Friday morning arrived gray and overcast, the kind of weather that makes lakes look like hammered pewter and puts tension in the air like an approaching storm. I followed my usual routine deliberately. Coffee on the deck, newspaper, the predictable pattern that Karen had been documenting for weeks. At 9:15, right on schedule, I loaded my weekly errands into the truck and headed for town. But instead of grocery shopping, I drove to the Starbucks 12 miles away and made the most important phone call of my retirement. "Richardson, you old sea dog." Admiral Morrison's voice carried the same authority it had held during my change of command ceremony 3 years earlier. "Please tell me this isn't about golf or fishing. I'm too busy dealing with congressional budget hearings to discuss your retirement hobbies." "It's about the boat, Admiral, the one you presented at my retirement." The line went quiet for a moment. In that silence, I could practically hear Morrison's mental gears shifting from social pleasantries to official business. "What kind of trouble are we talking about, Commander?" I explained the situation in military briefing format. Concise, factual, focused on actionable intelligence. Karen's harassment campaign, the escalating fines, the secret HOA meeting, and the planned seizure operation that was probably happening at my dock right now. "Let me get this straight," Morrison said when I finished. "Some HOA president thinks she can seize a U.S. Navy vessel because it doesn't match her neighborhood aesthetic?" "That's the situation, sir." Morrison's laugh could have been heard across the Pentagon. "Oh, this is rich. Does this woman have any idea what she's actually threatening to steal?" "I don't believe she does, Admiral." "Well, she's about to get educated." "Stand by, Commander. I need to make some calls." While I waited, I drove to the overlook above Sunset Harbor and watched the drama unfold through binoculars. Karen's convoy had arrived right on schedule. Tow truck, HOA board members, even a photographer to document their victory. They'd positioned themselves around my dock like a military operation, which would have been amusing if it wasn't so dangerous for them. The new towing company was already rigging chains to my boat when my phone rang. "Richardson, this is getting better by the minute," Morrison chuckled. "I just spent 20 minutes explaining to 3 different Pentagon departments why someone is trying to steal Navy property. The legal office is practically salivating over the jurisdictional violations alone." "What's the status of the boat, sir?" "Officially? Oh, that's the beautiful part. Remember when I told you she was yours to care for? What I didn't mention is that she's still technically commissioned. We never formally decommissioned her, just transferred her to retired officer custody pending final disposition. Which means what's sitting at your dock isn't just a boat, it's USS Defiance, hull designation PB-47, United States Navy. The implications hit me like a depth charge. Karen wasn't just trying to steal my boat. She was attempting to seize an active U.S. Navy vessel. The federal crimes alone would put her away for years, assuming she survived the political embarrassment of explaining to federal prosecutors why she thought HOA authority superseded naval jurisdiction. "There's more," Morrison continued. "We've been looking for a suitable static display for the Naval Academy Museum. A patrol boat would be perfect for the midshipman training facility. This little incident just moved that project to priority status. Through my binoculars, I watched the tow truck operator attach the final chain. Karen stood on my deck like a conquering general, clipboard in hand, directing the operation with obvious satisfaction. She had no idea that federal authorities were probably monitoring the situation through satellite imagery by now, thanks to Morrison's phone calls. "What do you need from me, Admiral? Just sit tight and let the system work. We've got assets en route to secure Navy property and arrest whoever's attempting to steal it. This is about to become a very educational experience for your HOA president. I ended the call and continued watching the operation below. Karen's photographer was capturing every angle of the theft, creating a perfect documentary of federal crimes in progress. The tow truck had nearly pulled my boat free of its slip when the first dark SUV appeared at the harbor entrance. Then the second, and the third. The vehicles moved with purpose but without urgency, the kind of deliberate approach that military and law enforcement use when they want to contain a situation without spooking the suspects. Through the binoculars, I could see uniformed figures emerging from the SUVs, their movements coordinated and professional. Karen's operation ground to a halt as the new arrivals approached the dock. Even from a distance, I could see her confusion turning to concern as she realized these weren't local police or additional tow truck support. These were federal agents in military uniforms, and they were walking toward her with the calm confidence of people who held all the legal cards. My phone buzzed with a text from Morrison. "Package delivered. Recommend you head home soon. Your neighbors are about to get a lesson in federal jurisdiction." As I drove back toward Sunset Harbor, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my retirement. The satisfaction of a mission accomplished through proper channels and overwhelming force. For weeks, Karen had wielded her HOA authority like a club, convinced that her small kingdom was beyond challenge from any higher authority. She was about to discover that the United States Navy took theft of its property very seriously, regardless of the thief's reasons or the value of their neighborhood's aesthetic standards. The boat she'd dismissed as an eyesore was actually a commissioned vessel of the U.S. fleet, protected by federal law and backed by the full resources of the Pentagon. Karen had declared war on what she thought was a powerless retiree. Instead, she'd attacked the United States Navy. The irony was beautiful, the justice was perfect, and the lesson was going to be unforgettable. As I turned into my neighborhood, I could see the crowd that had gathered at the harbor. News traveled fast in small communities, especially when federal agents started making arrests. Karen's perfect little HOA coup had become a public spectacle that would be remembered long after her presidency was just an embarrassing footnote in community history. The silence-eyed, maintained for weeks, was about to be broken by the roar of federal authority. And Karen was going to learn that some fights involve enemies far more dangerous than retired naval officers with old boats. The ocean doesn't bow to neighborhood covenants, and neither does the Navy. The morning of the seizure, the air smelled different. Heavy, electric, like the seconds before a storm breaks. I'd timed my return perfectly, arriving just as Karen's operation reached its peak confidence. The tow truck had my boat halfway out of its slip, chains groaning under the weight, while Karen supervised from my private dock with the satisfaction of someone who'd never doubted their ultimate victory. Her HOA army had deployed in formation around the water's edge, Bob Martinez documenting everything with military precision, Sarah Walsh handling paperwork with nervous efficiency, Jim Thompson counting imaginary auction proceeds on his phone calculator. They'd even brought folding chairs, as if they were settling in to watch their triumph unfold in comfort. The new towing company was more aggressive than Pete's outfit, their operator clearly motivated by whatever premium Karen had promised for quick, quiet removal. He'd backed his massive rig right to the water's edge, its diesel engine rumbling with the confidence of expensive equipment operated by someone who believed he had legal authority. But the most telling detail was Karen's outfit. Gone was the casual tracksuit of previous encounters, replaced by a navy blue business suit that she'd probably borrowed from her teaching days. She carried herself like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments, her clipboard transformed into evidence that would justify whatever legal challenges might follow. "Careful with those chains," she called to the operator. "We want this removed intact so it can be properly disposed of at auction." The crowd of onlookers had grown throughout the morning. Word spreads fast in communities like ours, and the spectacle of an HOA seizing someone's boat was unprecedented entertainment. Neighbors lined the shore with coffee cups and camera phones, watching the drama unfold like it was scheduled programming. Most faces showed curiosity mixed with discomfort, people who'd never challenged Karen's authority, but sensed this confrontation had crossed lines they couldn't quite identify. A few displayed open hostility, neighbors who'd suffered their own HOA harassment campaigns and were enjoying Karen's moment of apparent triumph. But Mrs. Chen stood apart from the crowd, her expression tight with worry. She caught my eye as I approached and shook her head slightly, a warning that something was wrong, that the situation had escalated beyond normal neighborhood politics. I parked at the public access point and walked toward my dock with deliberate calm, my pace neither rushed nor hesitant. Karen spotted me immediately, her face lighting up with predatory satisfaction. "Mr. Richardson," she called out, her voice carrying across the water with theatrical projection. "Perfect timing. You can witness the lawful removal of your property violation." The crowd fell silent, sensing that the main event was about to begin. Even the tow truck operator paused his work, chains still groaning but movement stopped, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. I approached the dock with my hands visible and empty. Old military habit when dealing with potentially hostile situations. Karen's confidence was intoxicating her, making her careless with details like federal law and jurisdictional authority. "Morning, Karen," I said evenly. "Busy day for unauthorized seizure of federal property." Her laugh was sharp and triumphant. "Federal property? Really, Mr. Richardson? Even for you, that's a desperate reach. This is a private boat on private dock space, subject to HOA authority under binding neighborhood covenants." She gestured grandly at the assembled crowd, playing to her audience like a politician at a rally. "Ladies and gentlemen, witness the lengths some people will go to avoid responsibility. Mr. Richardson would have you believe his rusty, old boat is somehow protected by the federal government." The crowd murmured with confused interest. Karen's performance was compelling, confident, backed by official paperwork, supported by what looked like proper legal procedures. To most observers, I probably looked like a desperate man making wild claims to avoid consequences. "You should stop this now," I said quietly, my voice carrying just far enough for the tow truck operator to hear. "That vessel is U.S. Navy property. Touching it without authorization is a federal crime." Karen's eyes blazed with righteous fury. "Are you seriously going to stand there and lie to our entire community? This is your boat, registered in your name, docked at your private slip. There's nothing military about it except your delusions of importance." She pulled out her phone, waving it like evidence. "I've done my research, Mr. Richardson. State registration database, local harbor authority, even the Coast Guard auxiliary. This boat is privately owned civilian property, period." The crowd was definitely on her side now. Karen's homework looked thorough. Her authority seemed legitimate, and my claims sounded like the desperate fabrications of someone trying to avoid accountability. Even Mrs. Chen was watching me with concerned confusion. "Ma'am," the tow truck operator called out, "maybe we should verify—" "Verify what?" Karen snapped. "I've shown you the registration, the HOA authority, the accumulated violations. This is a lawful seizure of property in violation of community standards. There's nothing to verify except Mr. Richardson's inability to follow simple rules. But the operator had noticed what Karen missed. Details that marked this boat as something more than civilian property. Military-grade hardware doesn't disappear just because paperwork changes hands. The reinforced cleats, the specialized electronics housing, the brass plaque near the cabin door that read USS Defiance PB-47 in regulation Navy lettering. "Lady, I'm getting nervous about this," he said, backing away from the controls. "That registration might say civilian, but this boat's got military markings. If there's federal involvement—" Karen's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the fury underneath her professional composure. "Are you seriously going to let this man's lies intimidate you? It's a boat. Just a boat owned by a stubborn retiree who thinks his Navy service gives him special privileges." She was shouting now, her careful presentation dissolving into raw emotion. "I am president of this HOA. I have legal authority. I have documentation. I will not be bullied by an old man's fantasies about government protection." That's when the rumble started. Low and deep, like distant thunder but sustained. Growing stronger instead of fading. Every head turned toward the harbor entrance, where black SUVs were appearing in formation. Not the hurried arrival of local emergency services, but the deliberate approach of federal authority. The first vehicle stopped at the public access point, followed by two more that positioned themselves to control the area perimeter. The doors opened with synchronized precision, and uniformed figures emerged with the calm confidence of people who never doubted their legal authority. Navy uniforms, crisp, pressed, bearing the kind of authority that transcends local politics and neighborhood disputes. The crowd fell silent as federal law enforcement took control of the situation with professional efficiency. The lead officer, a commander by his shoulder boards, approached the dock with measured steps. His eyes took in the scene quickly. Civilian tow truck attached to military vessel, crowd of onlookers, local officials clearly out of their depth. "I'm Commander Walsh, Naval Criminal Investigative Service," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the water. "This area is now under federal jurisdiction pending investigation of attempted theft of U.S. Navy property." Karen's face went through a remarkable transformation. Confusion, disbelief, dawning horror as the implications registered. But her pride wouldn't let her accept defeat gracefully. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered, waving her clipboard like a weapon. "That's not Navy property. It's a private boat owned by a civilian. I have documentation." Commander Walsh turned his attention to Karen with the patient expression of someone accustomed to dealing with civilians who didn't understand federal authority. "Ma'am, you're currently attempting to seize USS Defiance, hull designation PB-47, United States Navy. The vessel remains under federal jurisdiction, regardless of custody arrangements with retired personnel." The crowd was dead silent now, phones recording every word. The morning's entertainment having transformed into something far more serious than neighborhood drama. "That's impossible," Karen whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. The presence of federal agents, the military terminology, the calm certainty of official authority, everything she'd dismissed as an old man's lies was materializing around her like a nightmare made real. Commander Walsh gestured to the tow truck operator. "Sir, please disconnect your equipment from the vessel immediately. Any further contact with Navy property will be considered interference with federal law enforcement." The operator needed no additional encouragement. His chains were disconnected and retracted with record speed, his truck backing away from the dock like it was radioactive. Whatever Karen had paid him wasn't worth federal prosecution. As the morning sun climbed higher, burning off the gray overcast, Karen stood alone on my dock, surrounded by federal agents, her HOA authority as substantial as morning mist. The perfect plan had collapsed in minutes, leaving her exposed and vulnerable to consequences she'd never imagined. And then the Navy saluted. The sight of those uniforms stepping onto the dock was like thunder rolling through the crowd. Commander Walsh approached. me with ceremonial precision, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden planks with rhythmic authority. Behind him, two other naval officers maintained formation, a lieutenant commander and a chief petty officer, both carrying themselves with the bearing that comes from years of military discipline. The crowd held its collective breath. Even the seagulls seemed to pause their morning scavenging, sensing that something significant was unfolding on this quiet community dock. "Commander Richardson," Walsh said formally, stopping 3 paces away and coming to attention. Then he saluted. It wasn't the casual wave civilians often mistake for military courtesy, but the crisp regulation salute reserved for recognition between naval officers. His hand moved with practiced precision to his cover, held the position with unwavering steadiness, waiting for my response. The muscle memory kicked in before conscious thought. My own hand rose automatically, returning the salute with the same precision I'd maintained throughout 30 years of service. For a moment, the lake community disappeared, replaced by the timeless ritual of military respect that transcends rank, time, and circumstance. "Commander Walsh," I replied formally. "Permission to come aboard?" "Granted, sir." The silence that followed was profound. Karen's mouth hung open in shock, her clipboard forgotten in nerveless fingers. The assembled crowd stared in bewilderment at this display of military protocol playing out where they'd expected a simple property seizure. Mrs. Chen was the first to understand. Her hand went to her mouth as the pieces fell into place. The boat's real nature, my actual background, the authority I'd never claimed but clearly possessed. Her grandson Tommy stood beside her with wide eyes, probably revising every assumption he'd made about the quiet old man who lived by the water. Commander Walsh stepped aboard my dock with the ease of someone comfortable on watercraft. His eyes took in details that Karen had dismissed: the regulation hardware, the proper maintenance that kept military equipment functional, the subtle modifications that marked this vessel as something special. "Sir, we've been directed by Admiral Morrison to assess the status of USS Defiance and investigate reports of attempted seizure by civilian authorities," he said, consulting official paperwork that made Karen's HOA documents look like grocery lists. "The vessel has been maintained in proper condition during my custody," I replied, falling automatically into the formal language of military reporting. "All systems functional, structural integrity intact, ready for transfer if required." Walsh nodded approvingly, making notes on his official forms. But it was his next words that transformed the morning from Karen's nightmare into her complete humiliation. "Sir, Admiral Morrison also asked me to convey his compliments on your stewardship of this vessel. The Navy has been seeking a suitable patrol craft for static display at the Naval Academy Museum. Your care of USS Defiance has made that mission possible." He paused, consulting another document with obvious satisfaction. "Additionally, the Admiral wanted me to inform you that your actions in protecting Navy property from unauthorized seizure will be noted in your permanent record. The service appreciates officers who continue to serve even in retirement." The crowd was buzzing now, whispered conversations spreading through the assembled neighbors like wildfire. The story was rewriting itself in real time. The stubborn retiree with his rusty boat transformed into a decorated naval officer protecting federal property from civilian theft. Karen finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "This is impossible. I researched everything. The registration, the documentation." Commander Walsh turned to her with the patient expression reserved for explaining complex concepts to civilians. "Ma'am, USS Defiance remains commissioned U.S. Navy property regardless of custody arrangements. Commander Richardson serves as her designated caretaker under federal authority that supersedes local jurisdiction." He gestured to the paperwork in his hands. "Your HOA bylaws have no authority over federal property. Your attempted seizure constitutes theft of U.S. military assets, which carries serious federal penalties. The blood drained from Karen's face as the implications registered. This wasn't neighborhood politics anymore. It was federal crime, complete with prosecutors who specialized in cases involving military property and defendants who thought local authority trumped national security. I didn't know, she stammered. The registration showed civilian ownership. I had legal advice. Ignorance of federal law isn't a defense, ma'am, Walsh replied with the calm certainty of someone who'd seen this conversation many times before. However, given that no actual damage occurred to Navy property, and considering Commander Richardson's recommendation for leniency, every eye turned to me. Karen's fate hung in the balance of my next words, her future dependent on the mercy of the man she'd spent weeks trying to destroy through bureaucratic warfare. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since this confrontation began. She wasn't the confident HOA president anymore, wasn't the righteous enforcer of community standards. She was just a frightened woman who'd made catastrophic errors in judgment and was facing consequences far beyond anything she'd imagined. "Commander Walsh," I said formally, "I believe Mrs. Weatherby acted on incorrect information and genuine concern for community welfare. While her methods were inappropriate, I don't believe federal prosecution would serve the interests of justice or community harmony." The relief that flooded Karen's face was almost physical. Her legs wobbled, and for a moment I thought she might collapse right there on my dock. But Walsh wasn't finished. "Ma'am, while Commander Richardson has recommended against federal charges, this incident will be documented in our files. Any future interference with Navy property or personnel will result in immediate prosecution, to the full extent of federal law." He turned back to me with a smile that transformed his official bearing into something more human. "Sir, we'll be arranging transport for USS Defiance within the next 2 weeks. The Naval Academy Museum is honored to display a vessel with such distinguished service record." As the federal agents prepared to leave, the crowd began dispersing with the slow reluctance of people who'd witnessed something unprecedented. Phones were still recording, voices still buzzing with excited conversation about the morning's revelations. Karen remained on my dock, clutching her clipboard like driftwood in a storm. The HOA president who'd arrived with such confidence was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned harsh lessons about the limits of local authority and the dangers of picking fights with unknown opponents. "Mr. Richardson," she said quietly, her voice stripped of all its former arrogance. I'm sorry. I didn't understand." I nodded, accepting the apology with the same calm I'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "Mrs. Weatherby, the Navy taught me that good intelligence prevents bad decisions. Perhaps the HOA could benefit from more thorough research before future enforcement actions." As the naval officers drove away and the crowd finished dispersing, I stood alone on my dock with the boat that had caused so much trouble. In 2 weeks, she'd be gone to her final posting. Not seized by an HOA president drunk on small-town power, but transferred with full military honors to educate future naval officers about service and sacrifice. For the first time, Karen had no words, and the silence was glorious. In the end, it wasn't the boat that defeated Karen. It was the truth, heavy as iron and unstoppable as the tide. The transformation of Sunset Harbor began before the Naval Criminal Investigative Service SUVs had even cleared the community gates. Word spread through the neighborhood with the velocity that only comes from witnessing something unprecedented. Phones buzzing, doorbell conversations extending into front-yard conferences, the social media networks lighting up with first-hand accounts of federal agents saluting the quiet retiree everyone had underestimated. By afternoon, my doorbell had rung 17 times. Neighbors who'd avoided eye contact during Karen's campaign suddenly appeared with coffee cakes, apology cards, and sheepish requests to hear the real story about my military service. Mrs. Chen brought her grandson, Tommy, who peppered me with questions about naval operations while his grandmother beamed with vindicated pride. "I knew there was more to you," she said, settling into my deck chair with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been proven correct. Karen never bothered to actually get to know her neighbors. She just saw what she wanted to see. The most surprising visitor was Harold Vance, the HOA secretary who'd tried unsuccessfully to warn Karen about potential complications. He arrived carrying a manila envelope, thick with official documents. "Emergency board meeting tonight," he said, settling heavily into the chair across from me. "Karen's resignation is already written. The other board members are scrambling to distance themselves from the seizure attempt before the liability lawsuits start flying." He opened the envelope, entretien d'HOAB, revealing legal papers that made Karen's violation notices look like grocery lists. The HOA's insurance company is furious. Apparently, attempting to steal federal property voids several clauses in our liability coverage. We're looking at personal exposure for board members who participated in the seizure operation. The irony was beautiful. Karen's perfect plan hadn't just failed. It had exposed the entire HOA leadership to the kind of legal and financial consequences they'd been threatening to impose on me for weeks. "What happens now?" I asked. Harold's smile was grim but satisfied. "New elections, new leadership, and a complete review of enforcement policies. Several residents are already filing complaints about Karen's harassment campaigns against other homeowners. Turns out, when people stop being afraid of HOA retaliation, they have a lot to say about abuse of authority." The community reckoning continued throughout the week. Bob Martinez, Karen's enthusiastic enforcer of aesthetic violations, found himself facing a recall petition signed by residents who'd suffered through his clipboard harassment. Sarah Walsh quietly resigned from all HOA committees, citing philosophical differences with the organization's direction. Jim Thompson, the treasurer who'd been calculating auction proceeds from my boat's forced sale, discovered that several neighbors were reviewing his past financial decisions with uncomfortable scrutiny. Apparently, the same attention to detail that had exposed Karen's overreach was now being applied to HOA spending records and budget allocations. But the real transformation happened on Friday. When the Navy returned, I'd expected a simple pickup, a truck, maybe a small crew to load the boat onto a transport trailer. What arrived instead was a convoy that turned the community boat ramp into something resembling a military ceremony. The lead vehicle carried Admiral Morrison himself, along with a delegation of officers from the Naval Academy Museum. Behind them came the transport equipment. Not a civilian trailer, but a specialized Navy hauler designed for moving historical vessels with proper care and respect. But it was the third vehicle that stopped traffic throughout Sunset Harbor. A bus carrying 30 midshipmen from the Naval Academy, crisp uniforms gleaming in the morning sun, their young faces eager with the kind of anticipation that comes from witnessing history firsthand. "Commander Richardson," Admiral Morrison said formally as he stepped onto my dock, "the United States Navy requests permission to collect USS Defiance for transfer to permanent station at the Naval Academy Museum." The ceremony that followed transformed my quiet lakeside community into something that belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. The midshipmen formed honor ranks along the dock while senior officers conducted the formal transfer ritual. Local residents lined the shore, phones recording every moment of a ceremony they'd never expected to witness in their suburban neighborhood. As USS Defiance was carefully lifted from the water and secured on her transport trailer, Admiral Morrison addressed the assembled crowd with the kind of speech that makes civilians understand why military service commands respect. "This vessel," he said, gesturing to the boat that Karen had dismissed as an eyesore, served her country with distinction in 2 theaters of operation. She patrolled dangerous waters, protected American interests, and brought her crews home safely through storms that would terrify most civilian sailors. His eyes found me in the crowd. When we retire a vessel to the care of officers like Commander Richardson, we don't simply abandon federal property. We entrust it to people who understand the responsibility of preserving history for future generations. The not-so-subtle message resonated through the crowd like a depth charge. Karen's attempted seizure hadn't just been theft. It had been an attack on national heritage, an assault on the kind of historical preservation that makes museums possible. As the ceremony concluded, and USS Defiance began her final journey to the Naval Academy, I felt the weight of 3 years lifting from my shoulders. The boat that had caused so much controversy was heading to her proper home, where her history would be preserved and her service honored by future generations of naval officers. Karen, meanwhile, had simply disappeared. No resignation announcement, no final HOA newsletter, no forwarding address for the neighbors who'd once feared her clipboard authority. One day, she was the neighborhood's self-appointed ruler. The next, she was gone like morning fog, leaving only the wreckage of her failed coup attempt. The lawsuits began arriving within days. Former HOA members seeking damages for harassment, property owners challenging previous violations, residents demanding refunds for fines that had been improperly assessed. Karen's legacy wasn't the perfect community she'd envisioned, but a legal nightmare that would take years to untangle. As I stood on my deck that evening, watching the sun set over water that no longer held my boat, I felt something I hadn't experienced since retirement began. Peace. Not the fragile quiet of someone hiding from conflict, but the deep satisfaction that comes from fighting the right fight at the right time for the right reasons. The HOA had tried to impose their vision of perfection on a community that included people like me, veterans who'd served their country, retirees who'd earned the right to live quietly, neighbors who deserved better than bureaucratic harassment disguised as community improvement. Karen had seen my boat as an obstacle to her perfect neighborhood. What she'd discovered was that some obstacles are immovable not because they're stubborn, but because they're supported by foundations deeper than local politics and stronger than HOA bylaws. The ocean doesn't bow to fences, and neither do the people who've sailed her waters in defense of freedom. Some fights are worth having, some principles are worth defending, and some victories are worth the trouble they cause. As the first stars appeared over Sunset Harbor, I raised my evening coffee in a silent toast to USS Defiance, now safely headed to her final posting where her service would be remembered and honored. Karen had tried to reduce her to junk, but the truth had proven stronger than prejudice. The boat was gone, but the lesson remained. Truth has a weight all its own, and it always finds the surface eventually. The ocean doesn't bow to fences, and neither do I.